friends, welcome back to my channel. Today I am going to be sharing with you my list of Indigenous authors and some of my favorite books by them. Why this list in particular? Well, June in Canada is National Indigenous History Month, and Wednesday, June 21st in Canada again is National Indigenous Peoples Day. It is a day to celebrate, recognize, and acknowledge the history, culture, traditions, and existence of Indigenous peoples, so First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people in Canada. I like to also think in the United States, while it is a Canadian holiday, I don't think we necessarily have to draw a line at the Canadian-US border. We can celebrate all Indigenous peoples in different ways. In this video, I'm going to be using the terms Inuit, Métis, and First Nations, and if you're not Canadian, you might not know what that means. And if you are Canadian, you might not know what that means. While the term Indigenous peoples is a sort of blanket term for all of the people and cultures that have been here before the Western settlers came, they are broken down into specific groups. And I'm not talking about specific tribes or nations or bands. I'm talking about three distinct culturally and ethnically different peoples. Inuit people are the indigenous peoples that are located sort of above the Arctic Circle generally. But this is northern Canada, primarily our territory of Nunavut, which is like a province. Also Nunavik, which is northern Quebec, parts of the Northwest Territories, and then Greenland as well. There are some migrants to Greenland in the 1700s. Métis refers to the distinct group of indigenous peoples at one point were mixed between Europeans, typically French, and specific First Nations peoples. This term does not refer to just someone of mixed heritage, like someone who is half First Nation and half white. Métis is its own distinct, like ethnically and racially distinct group of peoples. And lastly, we have First Nations, which generally refers to the rest of the indigenous peoples in Canada or North America. So south of the Arctic Circle and not Métis is First Nations. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that I live on the unceded lands of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. Also like and subscribe. Oh, and if you were curious, I am wearing a shirt designed by Paul Windsor, who is a member of the Haisla and Haltsuk First Nations peoples in BC. This shirt is the Sacred Salmon. I'm going to be focusing on fiction today, specifically fantasy and sci-fi. The first author that I would like to talk about today is someone you've certainly heard of before. It's Angeline Boulley. Angeline Boulley is an Ojibwe author of the Sault Ste. Marie Chippewa Indians, and her debut novel was Firekeeper's Daughter. Almost immediately, Firekeeper's Daughter was pronounced one of the 100 best YA novels of all time by New York Times Magazine. Firekeeper's Daughter is the story of a young girl struggling to fit in between her small hometown and the Ojibwe reservation nearby. She is torn between the two. It is a really, really beautiful coming of age story, and Angeline Boulley's own father is a firekeeper, so you know a lot of her life experiences are weaved into this book. Warrior Girl on Earth is her second novel, which came out earlier this year, just a couple of months ago actually. It is set in the same world as Firekeeper's Daughter, which is just our world. I haven't read it myself yet, but it is a story of stolen history. You also know it's good because Indigo, the company I work for, made this our teen pick of the month for June. The second author I want to talk about is someone who is brand new to the fantasy scene. It's Moniquill Blackgoose, who is of the Seekonk Wampanoag Rhode Island tribe. Her book, To Shape a Dragon's Breath, is about dragons, which is awesome, but if you read the description, it is also very much a conversation on residential schools. Here is the first line of the blurb. A young Indigenous woman enters a colonizer-run dragon academy and quickly finds herself at odds with the approved way of doing things in the first book of a brilliant new fantasy series. I think this is really cool because usually when we get dragon-inspired fantasy, it is either extremely westernized, like Eragon. No shade to Eragon. Love it. Or now we're seeing more Asian-inspired dragon fantasy because that just makes sense. So it's really cool to see a dragon-inspired Indigenous fantasy. This is something totally unique, and I'm so excited to read it. And just so you know, it is shelved as an adult fantasy, so despite the character being a young girl, this is not young adult fiction. The third author I want to talk about is someone you've probably heard of, especially recently. It is Cherie Dimaline, and her most recent novel is Venko, which just came out last year, or very early this year, I think. She is Métis of the Georgian Bay Métis Nation, I forgot to mention that. And so Venko is very much a blending of Métis culture and then like witchy vibes, which I think is really cool. Like we're very much getting Indigenous and Métis history blended with like a Salem witch trial situation, and then the magic of New Orleans. So this book is awesome. Her other book that I own is Empire of Wild. I haven't read it myself yet. And then a book that I want to pick up soon is her most celebrated novel, which is The Marrow Thieves. The Marrow Thieves is a young adult novel that explores the continual exploitation of Indigenous people by colonizers. One of my favorite Indigenous inspired stories is the Trickster series by Erin Robertson, who is another member of the Haisla and Hautsook First Nations. This is like a Canadian classic. Erin Robertson is a Canadian jewel. The first book, Son of a Trickster, kind of self-explanatory what it's about. This is a story of a total teenage dirtbag high school dropout who was again torn between worlds and discovering his heritage as potentially son of the trickster. On a more serious note, this series does examine things like teen drug use, racism, and themes like that. So it's not a young adult series. Again, this is an adult series. The fifth author here is another stunning debut author. It's Jessica Johns of the Nehio Sucker Creek First Nations in Alberta. Bad Cree is a story for millennials. It's shelved as thriller, but I actually think it's more horror. It's essentially a Cree ghost story. A lot of themes of family, old spirits, of grief, and it's a really, really wonderful book. The sixth author, I haven't actually read anything by him yet. It's David A. Robertson. He mostly writes adult novels that focus on themes of missing and murdered Indigenous women, as well as residential schools. What I have by him though is his middle grade series. So for like ages 8 to 12, this is the Barren Grounds. Can you see it? The Barren Grounds. David Robertson is part of the Norway House Cree Nation, which is part of the Rocky Cree Nation in Alberta. This series is described as Narnia meets traditional Indigenous stories, and it's only received rave reviews, and I'm really excited to read it. You might know that I'm not a fan of young adult novels, but I am a fan of middle grade. There's something just so whimsical about stories for that age of reader that make them actually much more enticing than young adult novels to me. While this is for younger readers, it still focuses on the foster system in Canada and some more difficult themes of culture and family differences. So again, just beware going into it. Look at this little friend. I know I said I was only going to do fiction. I know I said that, but I do have to shout out my favorite non-fiction book in this realm. It's Braiding Sweetgrass. You've heard of it. You've read it. It is by Erin Kimmerer, who is a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation in Oklahoma. She's the founder and director of the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment. She's a scientist. She's an educator. She's a badass. This is a non-fiction book that fuses Indigenous knowledge, scientific knowledge, and plant knowledge, and it's really, really, really awesome. I also want to point out that there's a Braiding Sweetgrass for young adults version, because this is a book that everybody should read. So if it's too advanced for you, get the young adult one. Well, I can say that we colonizers are doing our best to make up for and reconcile the atrocities and violence used against First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people throughout history. There's a lot more that can be done. One of the things that still happens utterly regularly is the silencing of Indigenous voices or just ignoring. But now, especially in Canada, we're finally starting to see Indigenous authors able to break into fantasy and sci-fi, as well as general fiction, non-fiction of course, and it's so important to just celebrate the baby steps, you know? It's awesome to see different cultural backgrounds being used as backdrops for high fantasy, hard sci-fi, that sort of thing, because we've had so many years of medieval European settings, and we're finally starting to see a lot of Asian and Middle Eastern settings, as well as a handful of African settings, some South American settings, and Indigenous, Canadian, and American settings. I would love to dive further into why it's so important to celebrate Indigenous heritage in Canada. Today's not the video for that, but maybe later. All of the information I shared today is based on my own research. If I mispronounced anything, I do apologize. If I got anything wrong about specific books or information, again, I apologize. This is all, again, just based on my own research and my own understandings. I did my best. Oh, and as I say with all like months and days that are celebrating a particular group of people, yes, it's important to recognize that June 21st is National Indigenous Peoples Day, but really we should respect and celebrate Indigenous peoples all year round and read their books all year round. and not just relegate them to a single month or day. This is the same for any designated group of people. Rant over. Those were all the books and authors that I wanted to talk about today. Obviously, this is not some kind of master list of every Indigenous author out there. There are so many more, especially in nonfiction. I don't read nonfiction, so I don't have that. Let me know in the comments down below if you've read any of these books and loved them, or if you have any other Indigenous authors that you wanted to share with me, some that I might not know about. Before I go, don't forget to like and subscribe and ring the bell icon so you know when I upload new videos. I upload 3 days a week. I love you guys. Goodbye.